As I sat there nursing my drink, I found myself going over the past few weeks in my head, trying to pull together any hard evidence of Freya's betrayal. My stomach was twisted in knots, and every little incident that had stacked up over time only added to the nagging unease that wouldn't let me go. Something was off, so off, but I just couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. I was nearly certain that something was happening behind my back, yet I had nothing solid to go on. No real proof, no idea of who, what, or even where. That lingering doubt gnawed at me, messing with my head, making me question if I was just imagining things or if she really was slipping around on me. But despite all my second-guessing, my gut kept insisting something was wrong. Whether it was a full-blown affair or some one-time fling, the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I'd been chewing on these suspicions for what felt like forever, but I couldn't shake the question of how long this might have been happening right under my nose. I took a slow sip of my Jack Daniels, giving the bartender a nod. He offered back a half-smile, like he'd seen this look 100 times before. The bar was quiet, with low murmurs that faded into the background, a dreary mood to match the gloomy weather outside. The people around me looked lifeless, as though they were just waiting out the rain before heading home. There was only one woman there, dressed way too fancy for this place, eyeing anyone who would look her way and gladly accepting drinks from some older guy. He seemed hopeful, but really, he didn't have to try hard. She was already into him. Most of the other patrons were just sitting around, killing time, waiting for a reason to get out. I was still sitting there, unsure what to do next, when a voice from behind made me turn. There was Madison, looking at me in that piercing way of hers, like she could see right into me. When I tried to say something, I found the words just wouldn't come. She stood there, her coat dripping from the rain, and began to shrug it off. I couldn't help but wonder why she was here, so I asked. She said she'd been worried about me, and had a feeling she'd find me here. She suggested we sit and talk, and I just stared, trying to figure out her angle and whether I could really trust her. I steadied myself with another swig of my drink and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move on, and then we picked the conversation back up. Our eyes met, both of us feeling the tension, each of us testing the waters of the situation. Madison pointed out that she'd noticed something weighing on me lately, like I was carrying a load too heavy to bear. I met her gaze for a second before looking away. There was something unspoken between us, something I wasn't ready to admit. I told her everything was fine, brushing it all off, but she wasn't buying it. It hit me hard as I realized that no matter how much I tried to brush it off, she could see right through me. She set her glass down, clasped her hands, and leaned in slightly. Then she hit me with words that felt like a punch to the gut. She said she knew what was going on. I played dumb, pretending not to understand, but Madison wouldn't let it drop. She suggested moving to a booth for some privacy, and although I wasn't thrilled about it, I followed her. Once we settled in, I tried shifting the conversation by asking what she thought she knew, hoping to sidestep the issue. But Madison wasn't fooled. She reminded me that after everything we'd been through, I couldn't lie to her. She was right. I'd known Madison since she was 17, back when I first started dating Freya. She'd always been around, and she'd even had a crush on me back then, though I ended up marrying her sister. Over the years, Freya and I had married and built what I thought was the ideal life together. We both had stable jobs, made good money, and from the outside it all seemed perfect. Meanwhile, Madison had grown up into a beautiful, confident woman. By her mid-20s, she was the kind of woman any guy would be lucky to know, let alone be close to. But now, as I sat across from her in that bar, I couldn't shake the feeling that my marriage, closing in on its 5th year, might not make it to 6. Madison, with that concerned look in her eyes, could see the hurt I was trying so hard to keep hidden. Before I could stop myself, my heart began to splinter as she finally said the words I'd been dreading. She told me, plain as day, that she believed Freya was cheating on me. My mind went blank, and I struggled to process what she was saying. I didn't want to hear it, and I sure didn't want to believe it. Part of me thought that if I just ignored it, it might not be real. Maybe if I kept looking the other way, I could avoid the pain that came with the truth. Madison must have noticed my blank stare because she asked if I was in shock or just in denial. She said she cared about me and was worried I wasn't seeing things clearly. Part of her even hoped this was all some big misunderstanding. But I kept brushing her off, stubbornly clinging to my own denial. Madison's frustration bubbled over, and her eyes flashed with anger, enough to catch the bartender's attention. I quickly waved the bartender off, reassuring him that everything was fine, while Madison apologized for the commotion. She was upset with me, sure, but it was only because she cared. She was desperate for me to snap out of it, to finally see things for what they were. She told me we needed to take action, and, though I didn't like where this was heading, I agreed to hear her out. Madison started to recall something from a few weeks back when she'd been hanging out with Freya. Apparently, Freya got a call and immediately stepped out of the room to take it. It struck Madison as odd, considering they were close sisters who usually shared everything. I nodded, feeling that familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. Madison then admitted she'd later checked Freya's phone, noticing that it wasn't even locked. The call had come from a guy listed as Dexter, but Madison had no idea who he was. She decided to keep a close eye on things, curious to see if anything else would happen. After a week or so, Madison pieced together who this Dexter was. He was some guy Freya had known ages ago, long before I was in the picture. They'd recently reconnected, probably through social media or a messaging app, and it turned out they'd been talking for weeks. I told Madison that, honestly, I hadn't seen any signs of something like this happening, even though I had noticed a growing distance between Freya and me lately. Madison nodded, acknowledging what I was saying, but went on to explain that Freya and this guy weren't doing anything blatantly obvious. Just little things that, put together, seemed suspiciously convenient. I tried to reason with her, suggesting maybe it was just two old friends catching up, but Madison shot that down, saying it seemed like it had gone further. Her response threw me off, so I asked her if I'd been missing something glaringly obvious. I explained how everything lately seemed to work against Freya and me, how we never had any time left for fun or connection. Madison just stared at me, an expression of disbelief on her face. "You can't keep burying your head in the sand," she told me, reminding me how much she cared about what happened to me. I pushed for more, desperate to understand just how bad things were. The look in her eyes told me more than I wanted to know, igniting a slow-burning anger inside me. I demanded details: where, when, and how had Freya been meeting up with this guy. Madison revealed that Freya had seen him at least 3 times over the last 2 weeks. She hadn't been sure at first, but 2 days ago, over lunch with a friend who worked with Freya, something slipped out. Her friend mentioned Freya had met the guy twice for lunch and once for dinner just last week. Madison asked if any of that matched up with anything I'd noticed recently. As I mulled over what she'd said, a few things came back to me, like those times recently when I called Freya's office to meet for lunch, only to be told she was out or had already left. Was that when she was with him? And then there was that seminar she supposedly went to last week, a last-minute work event that kept her out until after midnight. She'd said it ran long, and afterward, her team had a drink at the hotel bar to unwind. I remembered that night clearly. No intimacy, no connection. She just went straight to the shower and then to bed. My mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. Seeing how rattled I was, Madison warned me not to act on impulse, reminding me that I didn't want to do anything I'd regret or wind up in legal trouble. But I was past that point. My mind was set. She must have seen it on my face, her eyes flashing with concern as I declared that I wasn't going to let this go on. I told her I wasn't going to tolerate a cheating partner and vowed that Freya and this guy would both pay for what they'd done. Madison urged me to hold back, not to make any rash moves without a clear plan. Oddly enough, her calm voice helped me to rein in the anger a bit, making me more certain than ever that my suspicions were true. I then asked if she had any idea where Freya might be right now, and Madison didn't even hesitate. She said she was probably with him. That's why she had come looking for me. Her answer made my blood boil, and I slammed my fist on the table, drawing stares from other people around the bar. I waved the bartender over and turned back to Madison. "Do you know where they are right now?" I demanded, my voice thick with anger. She didn't know their exact location, but promised to talk to Freya tomorrow to dig up more information. Apparently, the guy was married with kids, though Madison didn't know where he lived. She vowed to get the details to help me. Reaching across the table, I took her hand, giving it a tight squeeze as I wiped a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," I whispered, appreciating her support, awkward as the situation was. Madison looked at me with concern and asked what I planned to do next. I reassured her that I wouldn't act on impulse, at least not right away, but I was determined to put an end to this. I told her there was no chance I'd forgive either of them, and that I'd make sure they both paid for betraying me. In the meantime, I needed to protect what was mine and start gathering my own proof. I finished off the last of my Jack, waved to the bartender, and left a tip. Madison still seemed uneasy as she asked when I planned to confront Freya. I thought it over for a moment, telling her I'd make a few calls the next day to start locking down my assets. I made it clear I wouldn't let Freya get a single penny from me. Madison pointed out how tough it must be to live with her, knowing what I knew, and I admitted that the past few weeks had been hell. If Freya hadn't picked up on my growing distance by now, she probably never would. Madison stood up to leave, suggesting we talk again tomorrow. I agreed, and she promised to dig up more details. As she slipped on her coat, I helped her, and for a moment, standing close to her, she looked so much like Freya. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at me, and I leaned down to kiss her gently on the cheek, assuring her that I'd be all right. She gave me a small, sad smile before disappearing into the rainy night. I sat back down, taking a deep breath as I began plotting my next move. One thing was for sure, they wouldn't get away with this. My revenge would be swift, cold, and without mercy. After that, things became a blur. Somehow, I found myself waking up in my own bed the next morning, my mouth dry and my head pounding like a drum. Rolling over, I noticed Freya was already gone, but I could hear faint sounds coming from downstairs. Swinging my legs over the bed, I stood trying to shake off the hangover. Stumbling to the bathroom, my mind swirled with thoughts of the night before and what was coming next. When I entered the kitchen, Freya was already there. She gave me a once-over and casually asked what kind of state I was in. I mumbled something about meeting up with an old friend and having one too many. I poured a glass of orange juice, downed it in one go, and poured myself another. She kept pressing for details, asking who this friend was. That's when I realized I needed a story. I mentioned a guy named Dexter, an old college buddy who was in town on business. At the mention of Dexter, I saw the tiniest flicker of recognition on her face before she quickly turned away. I went on, talking about our college days and playing football together. Freya pretended not to remember him, but brushed it off, saying it didn't matter as long as I'd had a good time. That was the first red flag. Sitting across from me, Freya was strangely distant, almost like she wasn't fully present. I casually brought up her evening, doing my best to sound uninterested while watching her closely. She claimed she'd finished work, grabbed a quick bite and drink with coworkers, and got home around 9:30. But I knew that was a lie. I had been home until 10 before heading to the bar. That was the second glaring red flag. She continued talking about her plans for the day, mentioning she might be late again. Then, almost casually, she dropped that her old friend Dexter was supposed to reach out to her. I forced a smile and suggested she invite him over sometime so we could all catch up. She hesitated a moment before agreeing, asking if I actually remembered Dexter. Her voice was casual enough, but there was an odd tension lurking underneath. I reassured her I was fine and that I could handle things on my own. In truth, my mind was already racing, working out the next steps of my plan. After finishing my juice, I took a couple of painkillers and told her I needed to get ready for the day. As I left the house, one thing was painfully clear. This wasn't over. Freya and her lover had no clue what was headed their way. As I got dressed, my determination solidified. I'd had enough of this farce. The thought of her sneaking around with Dexter fanned the flames of my anger, and with every passing second, my need for revenge grew stronger. My hatred toward him, some guy I barely even knew, intensified with every thought. The workday was a chaotic blur. Constant calls, non-stop meetings, and issues that kept piling up. My secretary managed a few calls for me, but there was no dodging the important ones. Even with the relentless pace, the tension inside me kept building, fueled by the burning need to settle the score. By mid-morning, the rush finally slowed, giving me a few moments to handle my own affairs. I shut my office door and started working on my finances. Within 15 minutes, I'd secured everything, moved funds out of reach, locked down our joint account. I even scheduled a meeting with a solicitor to discuss the steps for divorce. I figured I'd gather a bit more solid proof, but at this point, it barely seemed to matter. Freya had her own accounts, but I wasn't worried about those. The joint one was my focus, and now it was safely under my control. My personal accounts were locked down, and with no kids to consider, the divorce would be a clean break if it came to that. The only way I saw us moving forward was if Freya admitted everything and begged for forgiveness. And if she even hesitated, I knew it was over. The weight of that reality settled on me like a lead blanket. It saddened me, sure, but there was no going back now. I sat there in my office, quietly reflecting on everything that had happened and everything I'd done so far. I needed more information on Dexter, more proof. Or maybe just knowing the truth was enough to bring them both down. Just then, my phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Madison. I told her I was busy putting things in place to protect myself, and she updated me with more details on Dexter Clark. Apparently, he was married too, and she'd managed to find his home address and workplace, thanks to a friend who'd seen him with Freya. According to Madison, things were heating up between them, though they were trying to keep it under wraps. Feeling like I finally had something real to go on, I asked her for all of Dexter's information. Before long, I tracked down his social media profile and stared at his picture, feeling a strange, faint memory of him stir somewhere in the back of my mind. I decided to shake things up a bit and called Freya around lunchtime. As we talked, she mentioned she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Clark. Hearing his name come out of her mouth was like a slap in the face, a sick little taunt. I held back my emotions, kept my tone light, even though I was boiling inside. Strike three, I thought, as I resolved that swift, merciless action was the only way forward. After hanging up, I sat there for a moment, gripping the edge of my desk, my jaw clenched in anger. I promised her I'd see her later, barely able to stomach her saying, "I love you." Just then, my secretary walked in and offered to grab lunch from the deli down the street. I barely looked up but told her to bring me something heavy on red meat, something I could really sink my teeth into. She raised an eyebrow, giving me a curious look, but didn't ask any questions, closing the door behind her. She must have picked up on the tension simmering just below the surface, noticing the strange energy I'd been giving off all morning. While I waited, Madison was busy doing some investigating of her own. She stopped by Freya's office and spotted her stepping out of the elevator with a tall, dark-haired man, Dexter Clark, in the flesh. Without missing a beat, Madison approached them, casually asking Dexter how long he'd known her. Dexter looked caught off guard and stammered, clearly uncomfortable, as Freya quickly pulled him aside, claiming they had a meeting to get to. They hurried outside and hopped into a waiting cab, but not before Freya shot a nervous glance back at Madison. Back in my office, I chewed slowly on a massive sub, savoring each bite of the red meat as I mulled over what my next move would be. Madison called to confirm that Freya had left the office, and a quick check with her secretary revealed she wouldn't be back for the rest of the afternoon. My finances were secure, and I had a locksmith on standby, ready to change the locks at a moment's notice. My lawyer was also in the loop, just waiting for the final green light from me. Tonight was going to be the beginning of my plan. I wasn't about to tip my hand just yet. I wanted to toy with them, let them feel secure, right before the fall. My dad used to say, "Never let him see you coming. Go straight for the kill." Maybe I'd lost sight of that for a while, but it was time to set things straight. That evening, Freya came through the door looking like her usual self, as if nothing at all had changed. She acted completely normal, until I caught a faint whiff of men's cologne lingering on her clothes. As I leaned in to kiss her, she seemed to notice my hesitation. Without saying a word, I gave her a light peck on the cheek and headed toward the door. She called after me, asking if everything was okay and what I had planned. I assured her I was fine, saying I had a poker night with some guys from work. It seemed enough to keep her off my trail. Once I was out the door, I got into my car, grinding my teeth as I backed out of the driveway. I headed straight to Dan's place, my mind swirling with everything that lay ahead. Dan was a longtime friend, The kind of guy you could count on, no questions asked. He had his share of run-ins with the law and more than enough combat training, making him the perfect partner for what I had planned. When I called him earlier, he hadn't hesitated. No questions, just loyalty. Exactly what I needed. When I arrived at his place, we didn't waste time with small talk. We went straight to the garage, where I changed into dark overalls and pulled on a ski mask. We looked like a couple of silent ghosts, moving without a sound as we got into an old, beat-up car Dan had picked up a while back. The kind of car that wouldn't attract any attention. We drove across town, following the address Madison had given me. We didn't need to say a word. Everything had already been decided. Dan parked the car outside Dexter Clark's house, and we sat there in the quiet, waiting, each of us steadying ourselves for what was to come. The house was dark, except for a single light glowing inside. After a few minutes, the front door opened and Dexter stepped out. He got into his car and drove off. We followed at a steady distance. There was no need to rush. We already knew where he was headed. At the driving range, we parked in the shadows and waited, watching as the lot slowly emptied until only a few cars remained. My anger simmered just below the surface, making it hard to sit still. Every part of me wanted to charge over there and confront him, but I knew it wasn't time. So, we waited. When Dexter finally made his way back to his car, Dan slipped out of our vehicle, moving with a practiced, quiet ease. After he finished what we'd planned, I carefully drove us out of the lot, doing my best to keep things low-key. As Dan peeled off his gloves and mask, he mentioned how smoothly it had all gone. I turned to him, genuinely grateful, and thanked him, telling him how much it meant to me. Dan brushed it off, saying he still owed me from the past and could never fully repay me. I reminded him that friendship meant having each other's backs. At least, I added, his hands were clean, and with no security cameras in the lot, we had nothing to worry about. Feeling a sense of satisfaction with the night's work, we decided to head back. Dan suggested we join the others for poker, since the guys were probably at his place by now. We spent the next 4 hours playing cards, the atmosphere light, full of camaraderie. The guys sensed something was up with me and offered support that bolstered my confidence for what was coming next with Freya. But before I confronted her, I had a few mind games planned to keep her guessing. I stumbled through my front door just after 1 a.m., exaggerating a drunken swagger. Dan had arranged for one of the guys to drop me off, leaving my car there as an excuse. Freya, still awake, shot me a suspicious look as she asked why I was so late. I waved off her concern, slurring slightly as I mentioned Dan and the others had dropped me off since I'd had way too much Jack Daniels. I barely managed to hang my jacket on the peg, missing it completely before collapsing onto the sofa. Freya sat across from me, arms crossed, disgust clear on her face. I kept my expression blank, waiting for her to speak. She didn't hold back long, asking, "What's going on with you, Elton? Is there someone else? You've been acting really strange lately." I held back the surge of anger, forcing a lazy chuckle. Keeping my cool, I replied, "I'm fine. Just going through a rough patch, but don't worry, it'll all be over soon." My words lingered in the air, leaving her visibly unsettled, sensing something wasn't right, but unsure what. We eventually headed to bed, and I pretended to fall asleep right away, faking deep, steady breathing. It seemed to frustrate her, as though she'd wanted a confrontation, but I wasn't giving her that satisfaction. Not yet. The next morning, she was up first, making coffee in the kitchen. I dragged myself downstairs, keeping up the hungover act, exaggerating every motion. With a playful groan, I greeted her, rubbing my temples and mentioning the pounding headache. Without much enthusiasm, she tossed me some painkillers. As I sipped my coffee, my eyes landed on her phone, sitting right there on the kitchen table. I could sense her unease, like she wanted to grab her phone, but didn't want to seem obvious. I poured myself some orange juice and casually picked up her phone, making it look like I was just moving it aside. For a split second, panic flashed across her face as I glanced at an incoming message. Handing it back to her, I offhandedly mentioned that her battery looked low, adding that she wouldn't want to miss any important messages. Without waiting for her reaction, I left the kitchen and headed upstairs to get dressed. She watched me go, visibly rattled, probably wondering if I knew something, but trying to reassure herself that I was still in the dark. She thought she'd been discreet. After all, this affair had only been a few weeks of lunches, dinners, and 3 hotel meetups. To her, it was harmless fun, and she believed I'd never suspect a thing, especially since she didn't think I felt anything was missing at home. When I rushed downstairs, I sidestepped Freya's attempt at a more affectionate goodbye, slipping out the door with a quick wave and forced smile. At work, I dove into setting more of my plan in motion. Around 11 a.m., I sent Freya a casual text, saying I was sorry for being distant lately and that I had a lot on my mind, but promised her everything would be sorted out soon. I leaned back, waiting to see how she'd respond. Later that day, Madison stopped by my office, her face filled with concern. She asked me directly what had happened, especially with Dexter. Playing innocent, I acted puzzled, prompting her to reveal more. That morning, someone at the golf club had found Dexter Clark in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Freya had confided in Madison, clearly shaken by the incident. Madison asked me point-blank if I was involved. I brushed it off, acting indifferent, denying any involvement. I mentioned that Freya had shared the news through a work-related call. They'd informed her that Dexter had been hospitalized, and his wife had confirmed it. Madison seemed to accept my explanation, though she warned that next time, things might not be as simple for them. When she asked what I meant by that, I just smiled, saying accidents happen in the strangest places. That evening, when I got home, Freya was gone, and her car was missing from the driveway. Annoyed, I called her, cheerfully asking where she was. She replied that she was visiting a friend in the hospital and assured me she'd be back soon. I wished her friend a quick recovery and hung up before she could respond. About 30 minutes later, Freya came through the door, looking drained. Casually, I asked her how her friend was doing, hoping it wasn't too serious. Freya hesitated briefly, then said it was just a minor accident, and her friend would be home soon. Her voice shook slightly, as though she was struggling to keep it together. Something had rattled her, and I could sense it. I offered to make some coffee, and she seemed to relax a little, thanking me. As we sipped our drinks, she mentioned, almost offhandedly, that one of her company's reps had been attacked recently. Feigning surprise, I asked for details. She explained that Dexter had been assaulted and left in his car overnight, but quickly reassured me he wasn't seriously hurt. She suggested the attackers only meant to scare him, since nothing was stolen. I could barely keep a straight face, knowing how my earlier denial of even knowing Dexter might have complicated things. Freya seemed to notice my skepticism, her face tightening as if realizing she'd said too much. She quickly tried to change the subject, but it was too late. I'd already connected the dots. She quickly left the room, likely to make a phone call. I knew then that I needed to move fast. Things were escalating, and it was time to act. Calling out to Freya, I told her I'd be stepping out for a bit and wouldn't be long. Without waiting for her response, I got in my car and drove straight to Dexter Clark's house. When I knocked on the door, a petite, dark-haired woman answered. Introducing myself as Elton Thorndike, I told her bluntly that my wife, Freya, had been having an affair with her husband. Her face went pale instantly, and though she was visibly shaken, she invited me inside. Once we were seated in her living room, I laid everything out for her. I apologized for being the bearer of bad news, but I told her she had a right to know. I also informed her that Dexter was currently in the hospital. She broke down, admitting she'd suspected this for a while. She knew Dexter had been cheating again, but hadn't had solid proof until now. She was fed up with his lies and declared she'd be divorcing him, no questions asked. She wasn't certain how long the affair with Freya had been going on, but she was sure Freya was involved. When I asked her about the recent attack on Dexter, she admitted she had no idea who might have done it. I clarified that I wasn't involved, but, truthfully, wasn't sorry it had happened either. We speculated whether Dexter had tangled himself up with someone else's wife. Her bitter response, "Nothing surprises me anymore," summed it up. She explained they'd moved back to the area to try and leave behind Dexter's past infidelities, but it was clear he hadn't changed. Before I left, I gave her contact information for my locksmith and lawyer, figuring she'd need them soon. As I drove home, my mind was laser-focused on what still needed to be done. The anger I felt was sharp and controlled, fueling my need for a calculated, thorough revenge. The reality of my marriage ending weighed heavily on me, but there was no turning back now. Freya had betrayed me, and forgiveness was out of the question. The only comfort I found was knowing that the pain she'd caused me would come back to haunt her. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Freya's car parked in its usual spot. Tapping the hood absent-mindedly, I realized this might be the last time I'd walk through this door as her husband. Every step toward the house felt heavier than the last. When I entered, the weight of recent events seemed to press down on me like a physical force. The television hummed in the background as I approached the living room, where Freya sat perched on the sofa, visibly tense, her body language radiating unease. It was as if she knew everything was about to come crashing down. Her posture was rigid, her eyes trembling as they met mine, desperately trying to hold her composure. I stood silently, staring at her, watching her squirm under the weight of my gaze. I could see the panic behind her eyes, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. Without speaking, I walked past her and headed straight for the liquor cabinet. I poured myself a stiff drink, never breaking eye contact. She sensed the shift but couldn't read my expression. As I took a slow sip, her unease deepened. Trying to regain control, Freya straightened up, finally breaking the silence with a hint of frustration, asking where I'd been. I stared at her blankly and replied that I'd tell her where I'd been if she first told me where she'd been. Her eyes darted nervously as she stammered that she'd been at the hospital with a friend. I held her gaze, letting her lie hang in the air, watching her struggle. She attempted to shift the conversation back to me, but I cut her off, tired of the charade. I told her I'd met someone today, someone new, who had quickly become a friend. Then I casually dropped Dexter Clark's name, relishing the way Freya's face went ghostly pale. I could almost see the gears turning in her head as she tried to piece together how much I knew. Feigning concern, she asked if I was all right and offered to get me another drink. I pressed further, asking directly about Dexter, letting her feel the full weight of her deception. I laid it all out. I told her I'd known about her affair with Dexter for a while now. She immediately tried to downplay it, insisting it was nothing serious, just a fling. I scoffed at her weak excuses, reminding her of the vows we'd made and telling her how furious I was at being made a fool. She apologized, claiming it didn't mean anything and promised to make it up to me. I laughed bitterly, telling her she was only sorry because she got caught. I demanded to know if she would have ever stopped if I hadn't found out. Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She wouldn't have. I told her that lying had become second nature to her and that she wasn't the woman I'd fallen in love with anymore. As my words sank in, her confidence crumbled. Desperately, she asked what she could do to fix things, saying she'd do anything. But I'd already made my decision. It's too late, I said coldly. We're done. I called Madison and explained the situation, asking her to come over and help Freya pack. Freya, still in shock, asked where she was supposed to go. I told her bluntly that she could go anywhere, even back to her lover at the hospital, for all I cared. When Madison arrived, she didn't hesitate. She quickly packed Freya's belongings into a couple of suitcases while I stood by, watching the woman I once loved being ushered out of my life. Despite everything, I still wanted to make sure she left safely, but that was the last shred of care I had left to offer. As Dexter lay in his hospital bed, the full extent of his actions finally caught up with him. 2 other women he'd secretly been involved with began to visit him at the hospital, each unaware of the other's presence until one tense afternoon when their paths crossed. The confrontation was intense, filled with anger, accusations, and heartbreak, exposing Dexter's web of lies and betrayal further. Meanwhile, his wife, devastated by the news of his infidelities, filed for divorce and demanded full custody of their children. Hurt and humiliated, she was determined to sever ties entirely, leaving Dexter alone to face the fallout. With the scandal now public knowledge, Dexter's workplace took swift action, citing violations of corporate ethics. He was promptly dismissed, stripping him of his primary source of income. As the legal battles began, Dexter quickly found himself drowning in financial trouble. Divorce proceedings and alimony demands drained his savings, and soon he faced mounting legal fees with no way to pay. His reputation shattered, Dexter's once promising future lay in ruins. Even my wife, who had once found comfort in their affair, decided to end her involvement with him. She couldn't forgive the additional betrayals he'd kept hidden. Dexter's life spiraled further into isolation. The two women who had confronted each other at the hospital eventually left, unwilling to stay entangled in his chaos. Friends and family, disgusted by his actions, distanced themselves, leaving him to face the consequences alone. For the first time, Dexter was forced to reflect on the choices he'd made, recognizing the immense damage he'd caused not only to others but also to himself. In the wake of his downfall, Dexter was left with little more than the consequences of his own deceit and a broken life that might never recover. As the weeks passed, I found myself piecing together the aftermath of that stormy night. I kept in touch with Madison, who seemed almost relieved that everything had finally come out into the open. Our conversations were brief but supportive, grounding me as I adjusted to the quiet that filled my life now that Freya was gone. Surprisingly, Madison had grown distant too, as though she needed space to process everything. Still, knowing she was there was a comfort, a reminder that someone understood the twisted complexity of my situation. In the months that followed, Freya quickly realized that life would never be the same. Every new partner seemed to sense her past, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Despite her efforts to move on, there was always a lingering doubt in their eyes, a subtle hesitation in their trust. Conversations that started warmly soon turned tense, as each man grew suspicious, unable to believe she would stay faithful. As time passed, Freya found herself increasingly isolated, the dream of a happy family slipping further from her grasp. But that chance was gone, and with each failed attempt to connect with someone new, she began to understand that trust was a rare and fragile thing, something she might never regain. Alone and heartbroken, Freya was left with only memories and regrets, haunted by the life she could have had but had thrown away. One evening, months later, Madison and I crossed paths again, this time at a mutual friends gathering. She seemed brighter, more relaxed, and it was good to see her in a happier place. We shared a long look, as though acknowledging the unspoken history between us. There was an ease between us now that didn't demand explanation. After Madison confessed her feelings to me, everything seemed to shift. Realizing how much she had always meant to me, I could no longer deny my own feelings. In that quiet moment, surrounded by all the memories and years we had shared, I understood that I loved her deeply. Our love story unfolded with simplicity and sincerity. Madison and I got married, cherishing the peace and honesty we had finally found together. Our relationship was built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect, a rarity and something we both knew we had to protect. A year and a half after our wedding, we welcomed a son, filling our lives with joy and a sense of purpose. 2 years later, we were blessed with a daughter, completing our family. Through late nights, first steps, and endless laughter, we grew together as parents, treasuring each precious moment with our children and each other. Madison and I learned that love and respect were more than just words. They were the bedrock of everything that held us together. We cherished our roles as partners and parents, understanding that true happiness comes from nurturing the bonds that matter most. As our children grew, so did our commitment to each other, weaving a legacy of love and trust that would guide us through life's every challenge and joy. Thanks for stopping by our avocado infidelity stories, where the hidden truths of betrayal are brought to the surface. Each video uncovers real-life tales of deception, intense passion, and heartbreak, peeling back the layers of seemingly flawless relationships. From shocking encounters to secret affairs that upend lives, we reveal the raw, unedited truth behind the appearance of loyalty. Subscribe for more cheating stories.